The north is cold and full of whispers.
The man who died was called Cray, former soldier of House Glover. 22 years of hard service before the Black took him, then 12 more years of recruiting for the Night's Watch in the northern villages, moving from settlement to settlement on a horse that was always one bad road away from lame. Sleeping in the barracks at Winterfell twice a year when his circuit brought him through, he had no family to claim the body, no house to build a pyre, no children to carry his name into spring. Ned gave him the crypts. Not the upper levels, where the kings of winter sat in their stone chairs with iron swords across their laps and carved eyes that stared at nothing. Those seats were for lords of the blood, for men whose names would survive them in ways that mattered to historians and no one else. The lower crypts still had space, room enough for a Night's Watch brother who had spent his life in service to something larger than himself and deserved at minimum to sleep in stone rather than frozen earth. Maester Luwin came with torches. He carried the maps, old ones drafted by Maester Whaleys 30 years past, showing the passage routes of the lower crypts in careful ink that had faded to the color of old bruises on the calf skin. Luwin was past 50. He walked the descent carefully, one hand trailing the stone wall, torch angled out at 45 degrees, throwing his shadow long and thin down the passage ahead of them. The cold changed with every step. Not the cold of a northern courtyard in autumn. Something else, something older than weather, as if the stone itself was holding temperatures the living world hadn't touched in 8,000 years. Banked there like coals under gray ash, waiting for the air to thin enough to breathe them loose. Ned had walked these passages since he was a boy and had never once grown used to it. The cold in the lower crypts pressed against your sternum. It sat behind your eyes. It felt less like climate and more like memory, like the stone was remembering something it didn't have the language to explain. He carried Cray himself. The man had not been heavy in life. He was lighter in death. Luwin was 6 steps ahead when his pace changed. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply shifted into a different kind of carefulness, the walk of a man whose senses had registered something his mind was still 2 steps behind on. Ned watched him lift the torch and hold it toward the ceiling of the passage. The smoke wasn't rising. It should have risen. Torch smoke in an enclosed passage climbed. It spread. It followed the natural pull of heat moving through cold air. The smoke lifted 6 inches from the flame and then went flat. It ran sideways along the ceiling, pressed there, pushed by something moving outward through the wall, something on the other side of the stone, exhaling. "There's a draft," Luwin said. He was studying the left wall, coming from inside the stone. That shouldn't be possible. Ned set Cray down on the passage floor. He pressed his palm flat against the wall. Solid, cold Winterfell granite, same as everywhere. He moved his hand 3 feet left. Nothing. Another foot. There. Not warmth. Not quite. A difference in the temperature's direction. A seam where the cold ran at a slightly different angle than the surrounding stone. A breath of air so faint he felt it only against the hairs on the back of his hand. Moving outward. Moving out of the wall. "Bring it closer," he said. Luwin held the torch near the stone. The flame didn't flicker the way it should in still air. It guttered sideways. One sharp pull, as if something behind the granite was drawing breath. Then it straightened. Ned looked at the mineral deposits along the wall, the pale calcite crust that built up on cryptstone over decades, recording years like growth rings. Natural calcite growth followed the contours of the stone, the joints between blocks, the variations in composition. Here it was even, continuous, as if it were growing over something made to mimic the surrounding stone exactly, a made thing disguised as wall, sealed so long the disguise had become almost flawless. Almost. "We'll need tools," Ned said. They worked for 2 hours. Not in silence. They spoke, but practically. The angle of the chisel, the direction of the air, what the consistency of the mortar might mean. Ned did not speculate about what lay behind it. He was not a man who spent energy on questions when the answer was 90 minutes of cold work away. The mortar was wrong. He felt it in the first bite of the chisel. Not powdered gray like lime mix, but something darker, harder, and beneath it a faint smell that he associated with the Winterfell godswood in summer, weirwood sap, set so hard over so many centuries that it had become something between wood and stone, but the tree was still in it, the organic ghost of it still in the resistance it gave the chisel's edge. He and Luwin said nothing when they both registered it. They worked faster. The door behind the calcite was iron, single cast, one piece not assembled, poured into shape, not worked in sections. Black with age rather than red with rust because the weirwood seal had kept it dry for however long it had been standing here. Along the frame, cut into the iron in a hand that had taken time with each stroke, were First Men runes, not decorative. The spacing was too deliberate, the cuts too deep. These were operational. Lewin translated 3, hold, keep, remember. The door came open in fractions, 6 inches, 8, 12. Ned put his shoulder against the iron, and Lewin pulled a rope looped through the handle, and the grinding was not dramatic, stone on stone, like a man clearing his throat in a large, empty room. Then it was open far enough for a man to pass through sideways. The air that came out was neither cold nor warm. It was still. The stillness of air that had been sealed inside something for a very long time, and had gradually stopped being different from the stone around it. Lewin went in first with the torch. Ned followed. 12 shelves of pale gray stone, 3 per wall in a chamber roughly 12 feet square, the ceiling arching to a point 7 feet up. On each shelf, sealed lead cylinders, perhaps 30 in all. The lead had not corroded, whatever was inside was intact. The scrolls were written on treated animal skin in 2 hands. The first hand wrote in Old Tongue, the pre-Andal language of the First Men that no living person spoke fluently. The second hand annotated in Common Tongue beneath certain passages, in a script that Lewin identified as 4 centuries old at minimum, possibly older. A previous Stark lord, or a maester who served one, had partially decoded these scrolls, and then, presumably, died before completing the work, or completed it and hid the fact. Ned read what could be read by torchlight over 3 hours. Lewin read faster. They did not speak to each other until they had both finished the first scroll, 3 parts. The first was a military history of the Long Night as experienced by the First Men, not as legend but as recorded event, with place names, force sizes, and casualty estimates. Ned recognized some of the place names. They were in the north. The wall was built not as a prophylactic barrier but as a staging fortification, the final fallback position after 8 years of retreat. The First Men didn't defeat the others by waiting. They armed themselves and counterattacked. The second part contained what the scroll called the Dragon Steel Covenant, the account of how the weapon was made, by whom, and what was required. It was partly allegorical, as ancient technical writing tended to be, but the operational details survived underneath the ceremony. The writer of the annotation had parsed out the most critical passages. Ned read these passages twice. The third part was a prophecy that the writer would not dwell on. The First Men had their own version of Azor Ahai, their own promise that the darkness would return. Ned set this aside. He was not a man who lived by prophecy. He was a man who responded to evidence. He also understood, immediately and without sentiment, what he was holding. This was not a relic. This was a competitive advantage on a scale no lord had possessed since Aegon Targaryen stepped off a boat with 3 dragons. The world had been arranged around the assumption that Valyrian steel was unobtainable. That assumption was now wrong. Lewin lowered the scroll. He looked at the iron door standing open at their backs, at the dark of the chamber, the 12 shelves, the cylinders still in their cradles. He was a man who had spent 40 years among books. He had just found the book that changed everything. His hands were steady. Tell no one, Lewin. Not the ravens, not the wards, not Lady Stark. A breath. Not yet. Understood, my lord. The ale rooms were wrong for drinking and right for everything else. 3 chambers cut into the living rock 40 feet below the Winterfell kitchens, directly above the deep hot spring channels that ran like veins beneath the castle's foundations. The constant temperature had made them ideal for fermentation, warm enough to keep the process alive, cool enough to keep it controlled. They had not been used for ale in 60 years, since Lord Rickard had built a dedicated brewery in the outer ward, and in 60 years the chambers had collected nothing but darkness and the slow mineral smell of water moving through stone below. Mikken had spent 2 months turning them into something that should not exist. He had no name for what he was building. He called it, in his own head, the deep work, and he called it that mostly to avoid calling it what Lord Stark had called it, which was the beginning of saving the world, and that kind of thinking made his hands shake, and shaking hands made bad work. The bellows were Lewin's design. The maester had spent a week sketching them on parchment, redrawing, scrapping it, sketching again, with the intense focused irritability of a man who knew exactly what result he needed and kept finding that the existing mechanical vocabulary was insufficient to produce it. What he arrived at was a hydraulic wheel set into the stone channel of the nearest hot spring outflow, turning a crank system that drove twin bellows mounted on either side of the forge hearth. No man needed to work them. The spring worked them, constantly, without rest, without the fluctuations in pressure that came when a human arm got tired. The hearth sat above the sealed stone chamber Mikken had built over the deepest spring channel. Not a conventional hearth, a sealed system, stone mortared at every joint, with the heat rising from below and the fuel burning from above, in a configuration that gave you two sources of temperature acting on the same mass of metal simultaneously. The fuel was Glover weirwood charcoal, dense, close-grained, burning hotter and longer than any other wood in the north, mixed with high-carbon coal from the Umber territories and composited in precise ratios that the second annotating hand in the scrolls had specified without explaining. Mikken had tested the mixture twice in the outer forge before trusting it in here. Both times the heat had done things he did not have a reference for. He still did not have a reference for them. What he had was Lord Stark. Ned had come to him in the outer forge 3 months past, in the hour before dawn when the castle was between its night watch and its morning work, and the forge yard held nothing but the banked coals and the particular silence of a place built around fire when the fire is sleeping. He had come without guards, without Lewin, without the deliberate political weight Mikken had watched him carry since coming home from the south, 14 years ago. He sat on the iron bench where Mikken rested his feet when the day ran long. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he told Mikken everything. The Night's Watch reports, 3 years of them, ranger parties coming back wrong, coming back half-sized, coming back not at all, the sealed chamber in the lower crypts, the lead cylinders, the scrolls, what the scrolls described, what it meant, what it required. Mikken listened without speaking. He was a man who had learned that questions interrupted the flow of information, and that interrupted flow produced gaps, and gaps produced mistakes. He let Ned finish. When Ned finished, Mikken was quiet for a long time. He looked at the banked coals in the forge. He had spent 30 years learning what fire could do to metal. He had a good sense for the upper edge of what was possible. "What's it take?" he said. "From me. Your blood willingly given," Ned said. "Your oath on the heart tree, your silence." Mikken held out his right hand. "Show me the cut." They swore in the godswood at first light. Lewin read the old tongue words from a prepared sheet, slowly, giving each one its full weight. Ned spoke them, Mikken spoke them after. The words felt like something older than language, more like the action of putting a key into a lock than the act of making sounds with your mouth. When it was finished, Mikken drew his own belt knife and opened his right palm without ceremony. He pressed the cut to the heart tree bark and held it there until the blood stopped coming freely. The bark was cold and dry and took the blood the way old wood took oil, into itself without residue. He pulled his hand back. The bark showed nothing, not a stain, not a mark, as if the tree had been waiting for exactly that and had swallowed it without acknowledgement. Mikken wrapped his hand in cloth and went back to the deep forge and went to work. The iron came from Clan Wool's mountain territory. High carbon, dense-grained, pulled from a seam that the annotating hand had specified in the second scroll's margin, with enough precision that Lewin had been able to identify the deposit from the Winterfell land records. When it arrived on 6 ox wagons under cover of standard supply delivery, Mikken spent 2 days sorting it by hand, not by eye, by feel, by the weight of each piece in his grip and the sound it made when he struck it with a test hammer. He rejected a third of what arrived. He kept what the rock in his hands told him was right. The first heating took 6 hours, the fold took 20 minutes, and when he pulled the metal from the hearth, it did not behave the way metal behaved. It moved under the hammer with more responsiveness than it had any reason to show at this stage of the process, as if the material itself was participating. Mikken filed this observation away. He did not share it with Lewin yet. He wanted more passes before he trusted his own perception. 11 days, morning to night, with Ned present for the first day and the last and checking on him between. The heat in the sealed chamber built to a level that made the air in the surrounding space shimmer even 6 feet from the hearth face. Mikken worked in leather and chain protection and still came up from the deep forge every 2 hours to breathe clean air at the top of the passage. He lost weight across the 11 days without noticing until the morning of the 10th day, when his work apron shifted on him in a way it hadn't since he was 32. He said nothing. He went back down. The blood covenant happened at the final quench. Ned stood beside him, not hovering, standing, the way a man stands who knows his presence is required and does not make it into anything beyond that. Lewin was at the back of the chamber with a torch and the scroll open to the relevant passage. He had the quench vessel on the stone table, lead sealed, holding water drawn from the channels that ran directly beneath the Winterfell heart tree's root system, collected at midnight 3 days prior, held undisturbed since. Mikken did not hesitate at the knife. The cut was clean, the same hand as before. The same line opened a finger's breadth further. He held his palm over the vessel and let the blood fall. It did not disperse. Blood in water dispersed. That was what blood did in water. It bloomed outward, it clouded, it diluted into the medium. This blood hit the surface and was simply gone. Not absorbed in a visible sense. Not dissolved. Gone. As if the water had been waiting for it and had taken it somewhere the eye could not follow. Lewin underlined something in his notes with a hand that was not entirely steady. Mikken took the blade from the final heating and quenched it. The sound it made in the water was not the sound steel made. It was lower, slower, as if the metal and the water were negotiating rather than reacting. Mikken held it under until the water stilled. He lifted it out. He turned it in the torchlight. Black, not the dark gray of good northern iron after quench, not the midnight blue of high-carbon steel held to certain angles of light. Black the way a sky with no stars was black. Light entered it and did not return. He rotated it once and the ripple pattern appeared. Blue, deep blue, the color of water over black stone at the bottom of a deep river, visible for one breath and then gone back into the dark as he rotated the blade further. 32 inches, grip to tip. He hefted it and his arm made immediate and involuntary adjustments for a balance point 6 inches further back toward the hilt than any blade he had held in 52 years of living around steel. He set it on the stonework bench. He picked up a castle-forged short sword from the wall rack. Good work, his own work made for a Winterfell guardsman 2 years prior, straight and true and the best grade of northern steel he knew how to produce. He set the edge of the black blade against the flat of the short sword and drew it across. The short sword parted. Not broke, not bent. Parted, the two halves separating cleanly and falling to the stone floor with a paired sound that was almost gentle, the way a book fell when you let it slide from your hands. The cut surface on both pieces showed clean metal, not a jagged fracture. A cut. Mikken put the black blade down on the bench. He put both hands on his knees and breathed. Lewin said nothing. He was writing. After a while Ned said quietly, "Well?" Mikken straightened. He looked at the blade, at the two halves on the floor, at the blade again. "1 per week," he said. "Maybe, if the iron holds." Lewin was already calculating. At 1 blade per week, he said. 52 in a year, not sufficient, not close to sufficient. To arm the wall meaningfully, they needed hundreds. More smiths meant more oaths. More oaths meant more people inside the knowledge. Each person was a door through which the secret could leave. Ned looked at the black blade on the bench. He reached out and wrapped it in the oilcloth he had brought for the purpose. He folded the cloth over carefully at each end. "Expand the operation," he said. Carefully. He left. Mikken remained. He did not have cause to stay. His work for the night was finished. But he stayed anyway, in the heat of the deep forge, with the smell of weirwood charcoal and spring water, and something else he had no name for still in the air around him. The wrapped blade sat on the bench in the torch shadow. Mikken had worked steel for 30 years. Steel cooled after quench. It did not hold warmth. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the oilcloth. Warm, still warm. 20 minutes out of the quench, and still radiating something that should not have been left in it. He pulled his hand back. He went upstairs. The royal column appeared on the southern road at the hour before midday, and Ned Stark watched it come from horseback at the head of his household guard, and felt, for the first time in 3 months, the specific awareness of a man standing in 2 realities at once. In one reality, his oldest friend was arriving after years of absence, older and drinking, and still magnificent in the way that men who had once been extraordinary and had since spent a decade consuming themselves toward the grave could still sometimes be magnificent. The king was coming. There would be warmth and noise and mead, and the particular pleasure of sitting with someone who had known you before the world had opinions about you. In the other reality, 40 feet below the courtyard where this reunion would occur, sealed behind an iron door that smelled of weirwood, were 30 lead cylinders that had changed the axis of everything. Ned breathed through both of them. He was getting better at that. The first wagon broke the tree line half a mile out, then the cavalry screen, then the banners, gold antlers on black, the stag of House Baratheon catching the gray northern light and throwing it back with the particular vividness of southern colors in a landscape that mostly declined to be vivid. Behind the cavalry, 4 white horses pulling a covered litter, and behind that the rest, servants, more cavalry, Gold cloaks looking cold and performing not looking cold. Wagons of supply, another screen at the rear. Jory Cassel was to Ned's left. He was looking at the approaching column the way a man looked at complicated ground before he had to move an army across it. How many? Ned asked. 300, give or take. A pause, not counting the gold cloaks. Ned nodded. The Raven count from Moat Cailin had been accurate. The column moved through the southern gate and into the outer courtyard, and the sound of it filled the yard. Hooves, harness, the creak of wagon wood, the compressed noise of a large procession trying to arrange itself in a space it had slightly overestimated. The northern stable hands moved calmly among the arriving horses. The southern horses were skittish. Northern yards had a smell that horses from below the neck disliked, something in the cold and the pine smoke and the mineral quality of the water. They always needed settling. The litter slowed, stopped, the curtain moved. Robert Baratheon dropped it back before it was fully open. He was framed in the gap, the enormous face, the dark beard shot through now with gray, the eyes that had once been the sharpest Ned had ever seen in a man's skull and were still, underneath whatever the years had done to everything else, still quick. He was looking at the household guard lining the approach, looking at the spear tips, not staring, not pointing, looking the way a man looked who had spent the years that mattered learning to assess threat with peripheral attention rather than direct gaze. The spear tips caught the gray northern light and gave nothing back. They absorbed it the way water in a deep well absorbed a thrown stone, and Robert's war eyes registered this as wrong before his mind had formed the words to explain why. The curtain fell back. Ned heard, through the litter's side panel, Robert's voice, a short sentence to whoever was inside with him. He couldn't make out the words. The door opened and Robert came out, and he was enormous, and he was here, and something unknotted slightly in Ned's chest that he hadn't known was knotted. They held each other in the yard the way men who had gone to war together held each other, less an embrace than a mutual confirmation of continued structural integrity. Robert's grip was still significant. His hands still worked the way they always had. "You've gotten gray," Robert said. "You've gotten large," Ned said. Robert looked down at himself and back up with the expression of a man who found this observation accurate and intended to resent it at his own convenience. "It's the South. Everything's too warm and there's too much food and there's nothing to kill." Then his eyes went sideways. Deliberately casual, the move of a man who had been practicing casualness since before Ned knew him, toward the household guard. One spear tip. Then back to Ned's face. "We'll talk," Robert said. "Yes," Ned said. "We will." Jon Snow stood in the press of household staff at the courtyard's northern edge. He was there because the formal greeting line was for true-born Stark children, and Ned would not change the rules of that particular arrangement on the day of a royal arrival when changing them would create more questions than the day could absorb. Jon understood this without it needing to be said. He was learning to understand things without them needing to be said. He stood among stewards and grooms and watched the column settle. Robert, moving toward the great doors, swept the assembled faces the way men of his experience always swept rooms. Automatically, comprehensively, not dwelling anywhere. His eyes moved through the crowd and crossed Jon's face, the wild dark hair, the long stark jaw, the gray eyes that had been looking at the world from that particular angle since before Jon understood there was a world to look at. Robert's gaze swept past. He did not see what he was looking at. A bastard in a northern household was unremarkable, and Robert Baratheon had not survived 30 years of court life by spending attention on unremarkable things. He went inside. Jon watched him go. His expression told nothing. The gift came out after the first evening's supper. Ned had timed it correctly. Robert was full and warm, and in the specific mood that followed good food in a man who had spent too long eating indifferent meals in southern heat. Generous, slightly nostalgic. The hard edges of kingship softened just enough by fire and mead, and the relief of being somewhere that had expected nothing from him for 15 years. The box was plain wood, uncarved, northern wool inside it, gray, the knife lying on the wool, 10 inches, handle of antler and northern pine, the blade the color of deep water in a room with no windows. Robert reached for it before anyone spoke. He always reached. His hands wanted things before his mind gave them permission. He picked it up, and the weight settled into his palm, and something changed in his face. A fractional shift, the automatic recalibration of a man whose body had spent decades knowing steel and had just received information his mind was still several seconds behind on. He turned it. In the firelight, the ripple appeared. blue-black oil on dark water, present for one breath as the blade rotated and then swallowed back into itself as it rotated further. Robert stopped rotating it. He went back the other way. There it was again. There and gone. He was silent for 15 seconds. Ned had known Robert Baratheon for 30 years. He had never watched him hold silence for 15 consecutive seconds about anything. "Where did this come from?" Robert said. Not a question, a demand that had learned to wear a question's shape. "From the north, your grace." Ned kept his voice level. "The old gods provide." Robert looked at him across the knife. "Don't do that. Don't old gods me. Where did this come from?" "From the north." Same tone, same level. Robert set the knife down and picked it up again. He could not stop handling it. His thumb found the edge and pressed, carefully, the test of a man who knew exactly how to test an edge without cutting himself. He pulled his thumb back and looked at the pad. A thin, bright line. He looked at Ned. "Ned, your grace. I'm asking you as your friend. I know you are." Ned met his eyes. "And I'm telling you as your friend that what I have is safe, that it's being used for the right purpose. That when the real darkness comes, the one the Night's Watch has been reporting for 3 years while the South finds reasons to ignore it, what I'm building in the North will be the only answer that matters." A pause. "That's what I can tell you tonight." Robert stared at him. The fire between them moved. Something built in Robert's face. Not anger, something under anger, something heavier and less comfortable than anger. The expression of a man who has just understood that his oldest friend has kept something from him, and has kept it from him deliberately and correctly, and he hates both of those things equally. "You kept this from me. I kept it safe. From me, Ned. From everyone." Ned held his gaze without moving, including you. The firelight between them, especially you. Robert's jaw moved. He was building towards something, the argument, the demand, the king asserting the prerogatives of kings, then the thing underneath all of it, the part of him that was still, under everything the throne had done to him, the boy who had grown up knowing that Ned Stark did not move when he planted his feet. That part won. He laughed. Genuine, chest deep, the first real thing Ned had seen from him since the column came through the gate. He clapped Ned's shoulder once, hard enough to shift him 2 inches sideways on his chair. "Gods above," he said. "What does the North actually cost to run?" Cersei Lannister had been watching from across the table since the box came out. She had watched the knife, she had watched Robert's hands, she had watched Ned's face during the silence, and during each of the 3 refusals, and she had filed every observation in the cold archive behind her eyes where she kept things she did not yet know what to do with. She excused herself before the supper finished. No explanation. She had long ago stopped offering explanations in rooms where she was the most intelligent person present. In her chambers, she sat at the writing table and did not take long. She knew what she had seen. She knew what it meant. What she did not know was the process, the scale, or the timeline. And those 3 things required a mind that had been solving problems of exactly this shape for 40 years. The Raven left Winterfell's Maester Tower before the midnight bell. It flew south, to her father. The pretext was grain. Winter grain reserves were a legitimate administrative concern for a lord departing his seat for an extended period in the south. Inspecting White Harbor's storage capacity before leaving the north in Robb's hands was exactly the kind of thorough, unglamorous duty that characterized Eddard Stark's governance and gave no one anything interesting to report. Ned rode out of Winterfell's southern gate 2 weeks after Robert's column disappeared, down the King's Road with Lewin on his left, Jory Castle behind him, and 6 household riders as escort. No ravens had preceded them. The invitation had gone out by mounted courier, spoken rather than written, to 3 lords. The road to White Harbor ran east across the open country of the lower north, through the flat cold of the coastal approach where the wind came off the Bay of Ice, and had nothing between itself and your face for 300 miles. After 2 days of it, Jory's nose was bleeding from the dry cold, and Lewin had given up on ink and was making his notes in charcoal on scraped skin, which worked in conditions that froze ink solid. Ned rode without complaint. He had been riding in this country since he was 8. The cold was information, not discomfort. It told you the season, the wind direction, the distance to the coast. He used it and did not fight it. White Harbor came up on the 3rd day, the new castle sitting above the harbor on its promontory, like a man pleased with himself at a table slightly too small for his frame, which accurately described Lord Wyman Manderley, who had sent a single line back with the courier after receiving the spoken invitation. The line was, "I will have the kitchens informed." Manderley received them in a private dining room that occupied the new castle's interior. No external windows, doors shut before the formal greeting had fully concluded. Food on the table. 3 candles burning on the sideboard, turned so their light fell on the room's center and left the doorways in relative dark. It was the room of a man who understood that some conversations required a particular quality of enclosure. The other 2 were already there. John Umber occupied a chair that was technically large enough for him, and in practice appeared to be conducting an argument with his proportions. He was 6.5 feet of organized obstruction, with a beard that had gone gray at the edges, and hands that looked like they had been assembled for a different and larger species. He was eating. He looked up when Ned entered, assessed what he saw, and went back to eating. Lady Mage Mormont sat at the far end of the table with a cup she had not touched. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, gray-streaked, with bare island in the set of her jaw, the specific quality of a person who had spent their life on a cold and difficult island, keeping wolves and Ironborn and winter itself from taking what was hers. She did not nod when Ned came in. She watched him sit down. Manderley had been standing. He sat last, with the careful orchestration of a very large man who had learned to make the act of sitting look deliberate rather than labored. He folded his hands on the table. His eyes, which his face worked hard to make look jovial, were doing something considerably more precise. "My Lord Stark," he said, "I confess I have been composing theories since your courier left. They have been entertaining company." "I hope what I'm about to show you is better than a theory," Ned said. He placed the dagger on the table between them. Manderley picked it up before anyone else moved. He was faster than he looked, and he looked at the blade the way he looked at ship manifests and grain accounts, with the attention of a man who had learned that the difference between what something claimed to be and what it actually was tended to live in very small details. He turned it in the candlelight once. The blue-black ripple surfaced and withdrew. He turned it again. There it was. He set it down and looked at Ned with an expression that started as something controlled and careful, and then, because he was Wyman Manderley, and he was alone in a room with people who had already been vetted past the point of performance, became something genuine. He laughed. Not the social laugh, not the laugh of a large jovial lord at a feast, the laugh of a man ambushed by the audacity of the universe. It came from low in his chest, and it lasted a few seconds, and when it finished his eyes were bright. "My Lord Stark," he said, "I am going to need more wine." The great Jon did not wait for the wine. He reached across the table and picked the dagger up the way a man picked up something he had been looking for his entire life without knowing it had a shape. He ran his thumb across the edge, not carefully, not the careful press of a man testing an unfamiliar blade, but the full drag of a thumb that had been hardened by 44 years of living in the way he lived, the thumb of a man who didn't hurt easily and wanted honest information. A thin, bright line opened across the pad. He looked at it, he looked at the blade, he looked at Ned. His face arranged itself into an expression that Ned had no precise word for. It was not surprise, it was not greed, it was something closer to the look of a man who had spent his whole life training for a war and had just been handed confirmation that the war was real. "Tell me what you need moved and where," the great Jon said, "and it gets moved." He set the dagger down. He went back to eating. The negotiation took 2 hours and most of Manderley's wine. Ned laid the operational shape of it in plain language. The forge already running beneath Winterfell, the iron supply from the mountain clans, the production rate, the timeline for scaling. He did not tell them the blood covenant. He told them the results. Manderley listened with the quality of a man building architecture in his head, where each piece of information fit, what it required around it to stand. He asked precise questions about White Harbor's role, the logistics of concealment, the paperwork trail for shipments south. The great Jon asked one question: how many men can we arm in a year? When Ned told him, he calculated something in his head with visible effort, and then nodded once, satisfied with whatever the sum had been. Lady Mormont said nothing. She said nothing through Manderley's questions, and through the great Jon's question, and through Ned's explanation of the distribution plan. Dragonsteel for the Night's Watch first, household guards of the participating lords second, a strategic reserve at White Harbor third. She said nothing when Manderley proposed the concealment terms, and Ned agreed to them. She held her untouched cup and watched Ned's face across the table the way she watched weather coming off the sunset sea, reading it for what it was actually doing rather than what it appeared to be doing. When the silence after the distribution plan settled, she said, "What happens to the secret when you die, Lord Stark?" The room changed temperature. Not in the way rooms changed when someone said something aggressive. In the way rooms changed when someone said the thing that had been sitting in the middle of the table since the beginning, that everyone had been carefully routing their conversation around. And its arrival was a relief even as it was uncomfortable. Manderly's hands stopped moving. The Great Jon set down his cup. Ned had prepared for this. He had prepared for it because it was Mage Mormont who would ask it, or someone like her, someone whose island had survived by planning for the deaths of the people who made the plans. "The scrolls have been copied twice," he said. "Both copies are sealed. Robb Stark knows where one is. Maester Luwin knows where the other is. Neither knows where the other's copy is hidden. To lose the process, you would need to lose Robb, Luwin, myself, and Mikken, who has the forged knowledge in his hands even without the written record, simultaneously and completely." Mormont looked at him for a moment. "Mikken's hands can be taken," she said. "Mikken's oath cannot," Ned said. "He swore on the heart tree, on the old gods." Another silence, shorter this time. Mormont picked up her cup and drank. It appeared to constitute acceptance. "They swore in the new castle's godswood at the close of the second hour. Small, as Manderly had warned them, a single heart tree barely older than the castle itself, its face only recently carved, the features still sharp-edged rather than smoothed by decades of weather. The weirwood face looked new and slightly startled, which was perhaps appropriate. What it was being asked to witness was not a thing it had witnessed before. Luwin read the first men words from the prepared sheet, slowly, with the careful pronunciation of a man who had learned a dead language from texts rather than from speakers, and was honest about the difference. Each lord spoke them after. Manderly's voice was surprisingly quiet for a man of his volume. The Great Jon shook the godswood slightly. Mormont spoke them last without ceremony, as she did everything. Each pressed their palm to the bark. The tree took what it was given. Ned was the last to step back from the heart tree. He looked at the four of them in the thin light of the godswood. Manderly's sharp eyes in his broad face, Great Jon's enormous stillness, Mormont's economical attention, Luwin behind them with his notes and his steady hands. "Project Winterforge," Ned said. From tonight, no one repeated it. No one needed to. In the quiet of the godswood, with the heart tree watching, it had the weight of a thing that would not be unsaid. 200 men made a particular sound on hard road. Not the sound of an army. Armies had a chaos to them, a friction, the accumulated noise of men not quite disciplined enough. Supply wagons with wheels that needed greasing, horses not fully trained to column march. This was something different. This was the sound of men who had been selected, who had spent 6 months training together in the Winterfell outer yard until their individual sounds became one sound, who carried weapons they understood and trusted. The rhythm of boots on packed earth was almost regular enough to mistake for weather. Jory Cassel rode to Ned's left and had not spoken in 2 hours. He was not a man who spoke when he had nothing to add. It was one of the things Ned valued most about him, particularly on a march where there were no tactical problems requiring discussion and speaking would only be the habit of noise-filling silence to avoid sitting inside it. They rode through the riverlands at the pace of the column behind them. 20 miles a day, 25 on good ground, less when the road softened after rain, and the landscape changed around them the way it changed when you moved far enough south to notice it. The trees different, the fields wider, the sky somehow larger and less committed to any particular weather. The North announced what it was going to do, and then did it. The Riverlands offered options. The spear tips caught whatever light the sky provided, not reflected it, caught it, held it for a fraction of a second, and released it differently from how it had arrived. Travelers coming north on the King's Road saw them first at distance and could not immediately name what was wrong. A merchant convoy 2 days south of the Neck had pulled its wagons to the road's edge to make room for the column, and the merchant himself had stood on his wagon board and watched with an expression Ned recognized. Not fear, the specific focused attention of a man who had encountered something new and was trying to fit it into a vocabulary that didn't contain it. The merchant had said nothing. The column had passed. That night, in whatever roadside inn he reached, the merchant would describe what he'd seen to whoever would listen. The description would not be adequate. The inadequacy would travel south faster than the column did, which was the point, and Ned had been counting on it since White Harbor. 2 days into the Riverlands, a cavalryman from a Bracken outriding party fell into step alongside the column on a parallel field track and watched the spear tips for the better part of a mile before peeling away without a word. A septon walking north with 3 novices stopped at the road's edge and stared until the rear guard passed him and then presumably stood there a while longer, staring at the empty road. Jory watched the Septon until he disappeared behind a curve. "Words going ahead of us," he said. The first thing he'd said in 2 hours? "Yes," Ned said. "You're counting on it." "Yes," Ned said again, and Jory nodded once and went back to not speaking, because he was Jory Cassell and he understood the difference between information he needed to act on and information that was simply true. The Gold Cloak Patrol found them at a junction 50 miles north of King's Landing on a morning when the road ran straight and the crossing gave clear sight in both directions. 30 men, well-mounted, with the posture of men accustomed to authority in their own territory, and managing, mostly, to project this while registering that the approaching column was something their training had not specifically prepared them for. The patrol captain separated from his men and came at a trot, past 40, a 20-year man with the flat, careful eyes of someone who had spent his career doing the jobs his superiors needed done without asking inconvenient questions about them. He pulled alongside Ned and matched the column's pace and looked at the spear tips for a long time before looking at Ned. Then he looked at the spear tips again. "My Lord Hand," he said. His name by his rank mark was Alar Deem. "What manner of steel is that?" "Northern," Ned said. Deem had the professional composure of a man who had received non-answers before. He kept pace, still watching the spear tips, and Ned watched him performing the arithmetic. 200 men was a large household guard for a hand. Not illegal, notable. The weapons were the issue. They were doing the thing they always did in any light, the absorption, the refusal to glare where glare should be, and Deem had been around steel his entire adult life and was registering without yet having the word for it, that these were wrong in a way that mattered. "I'll need to report the column's armament, my lord." "Report it accurately," Ned said. "No inflection, 200 men, northern steel, in service of the hand of the king, arriving in the capital at the king's pleasure." Deem wrote it carefully. He was a man who understood that this particular report was going to be read more closely than most of what he filed. When he finished, he looked at the column once more, the long dark line of it, the spear tips, the gray cloaks, the silence of men who didn't feel the need to talk while they moved. And then he looked at Ned with an expression that was professionally empty. He sent a galloper south before the junction was 100 yards behind them. By nightfall, the report would reach someone's desk. Several desks, depending on how quickly the Gold Cloak's chain moved, and how many people at the end of that chain had been watching for news of the hand's arrival since a raven left Winterfell 4 months ago. Ned wrote on. Sansa was in the column's protected center with her septa and 2 of her ladies, and she had been watching the Riverlands arrive around her with the quality of attention she brought to things she had been preparing to want for a very long time. The countryside was everything the songs had described, broad and unhurried. Farms with the settled look of good soil, and a climate that didn't require buildings to be constructed as if they might need defending. The light was different down here. Softer, less committed, the kind of light that made colors look like they were making an effort. She looked at her father and saw the things she could not name. He was the same. The gray at his temples, the plain riding clothes, the economy of movement that made southern lords look performative by comparison. But the posture had changed, or not changed, clarified. He rode the way a man rode when he was carrying something he trusted rather than something that was being taken from him. She had imagined this journey many times in her room at Winterfell, and in that imagined version her father had been burdened by it. The weight of leaving, the weight of duty. He was not burdened, he was simply going somewhere with something, and the somewhere and the something both seemed to suit him. She did not know what to do with this observation. She filed it behind the more immediate matter of King's Landing existing at the end of the road, which occupied most of the available space in her thinking. Arya was 3 ranks forward of where Ned had placed her. She was riding alongside Harwin, who tolerated this with the resignation of a man who had calculated that the only alternative was an argument he was going to lose. She had been watching the spear tips for 2 days with the focused assessment of someone who understood, at a practical level, exactly what they were. "I want one," she told Ned when he came forward. He looked at her. She was on a good horse and sat it well, and had already decided the answer she wanted, which meant the request was a formality and she was performing it under protest. "Needle is enough," Ned said. "Needle is castle forged. Needle fits your hand and your training and the way you move." He looked ahead down the road. A weapon that suits you is always more useful than a weapon that impresses other people. The blade that matters when the real dark comes will be the one its hand knows completely, not the most impressive thing in the room. Arya considered this with visible effort, checking it for structural weaknesses before deciding whether to accept it. She found something she couldn't argue with, and pulled back toward Harwin without entirely conceding the point, which was as close to acceptance as she generally came. Ned thought briefly of Jon. He had ridden north 8 months past, his own idea, not Ned's, and the right idea, to establish a Dragonsteel supply route directly through Castle Black. The Night's Watch had taken him without hesitation. Jorah Mormont, who had an old man's eye for the thing beneath the surface of a young man, had given him a ranging command within 2 months. When a White came over the wall on a summer patrol and Jon put it down, Mormont had pressed his bastard sword into Jon's hands the following morning. Longclaw Valyrian steel, the Mormont family blade for 4 generations. The bear's head pommel had been replaced with a direwolf before the giving, to honor the blood Mormont had known was there without being told. Jon had sent Ned one raven about it. 2 sentences. I have a proper weapon now. The wall holds. In Winterfell Solar, far to the north, Robb Stark read Lewin's cipher for the 3rd time. 62 blades complete. 8 sets of partial plate. The iron supply from Clan Umber runs clean. He set it down, he looked out the solar window at the training yard below, where 40 men were working through their morning forms under Roderick Cassell's supervision. 14 of those 40 carried blades that were different from the others. Different in a way that was invisible unless you knew what to look for, and then obvious in a way you couldn't stop seeing. He had been working toward understanding power his whole life. The histories, the arms counts, the harvest yield calculations, the mathematics of force and leverage, and the patient accumulation of things that mattered. None of those calculations had contained this. 62 blades. He thought about his father riding south with 200 men, and what it meant to know, with absolute certainty, that the weapons at his father's back could do something no other weapons in the world could do. Then he thought about the thing those weapons were being built to face, and the scale of the night that was coming and what 62 blades would mean against that scale, and the 2 thoughts arrived at the same place from different directions. They needed more time. More steel, more secrecy, and more of all 3 than they currently had. He picked up the stylus, 1 line. Hold the steel, hold the secret, hold the north. He sealed it, sent for the courier, then he went downstairs to train with his men, because a lord who only administered and never worked alongside the people doing the work was a lord losing something he'd need later, and Robb Stark had been paying very close attention to his father's example his entire life. A tournament of the hand was theater. Ned understood this the way he understood most things about the South, not instinctively the way Southerners understood it, but correctly, which was sufficient. The crowd wanted display. The great houses wanted to measure each other in a context where measuring each other too directly produced inconvenient consequences. The king wanted an occasion to drink publicly and call it ceremony. The hand was supposed to provide all of this, to pay for all of this, and to sit in the gallery looking magnanimous, while the various forces of the realm competed for prize money that ultimately came from Northern grain and Stark silver. Ned intended to provide something else as well. He entered 6 men in the melee, not the joust. The joust was individual, the confrontations predetermined by bracket, and the moment a Dragonsteel lance tip met a castle-forged plate, the meaning would be too direct, too legible. The melee was different. The melee was chaos with an outcome, and in chaos things happened that no one had specifically arranged. And the things that happened in chaos were the things people talked about afterward because they had witnessed them rather than been shown them. The 6 men he selected were not the tallest men in his guard, not the most decorated. They wore plain gray mail with no house sigil prominent, northern spears with dragonsteel tips, and the particular quality of stillness that came from men who had been told exactly what their job was and had no questions about it. Harwin was among them. Ned placed him in the center of the 6. The melee ground was churned to mud from the morning's rain. 43 fighters entered the ring when the horn sounded, household guards of various great houses, a dozen hedge knights with ambitions and the arms to pursue them, 2 Kingsguard members in the white cloaks that made them immediately identifiable at any distance. The crowd along the fence line was 3 deep before the horn finished. Above them, in the nobles' stand, the gallery watched with the calibrated attention of people who were watching politics perform as sport. Ned had a cup of wine and did not touch it. The melee settled into its opening pattern. Early engagements at the edges while the experienced men held center ground, hedge knights proving things to themselves in the outer ring, household guards moving in coordinated clusters. The 6 northerners found the position Ned had assigned them, left center, back thirds of the field, presenting no immediate target, not advancing. They stood with their spears angled and waited. The waiting was the instruction. Don't seek, be found. Sir Meryn Trant found them in the melee's second quarter hour. He was not stupid. He was a man whose intelligence had been entirely devoted for 2 decades to the specific problem of physical dominance in controlled combat. And within that narrow application, he was formidable. He moved through the melee's chaos with the economy of a man who had learned to conserve effort. And when his eyes swept the field and landed on the cluster of gray-mailed northerners standing in their position, he made the calculation that experienced fighters always made. Find a man who looks like he can be made an example of. Make the example. Let the crowd see it. He selected Harwin, anonymous gray male, plain northern spear, no identifying mark, a face that suggested competence without threatening brilliance. Trant started moving toward him with the particular quality of purpose that cleared space in a crowd. Harwin saw him coming. His expression did not change. He had been told about Trant specifically and about the Kingsguard generally, the way all of Ned's men had been briefed on relevant threats in the field of operation. He knew the white cloak. He knew the castle-forged longsword. He knew what was going to happen when that sword met his spear, and the knowledge sat in him with perfect stillness. Trant closed the last 10 feet and swung at the spear shaft. The shaft was ash wood. The blow landed on the ash above the dragon steel tip. The ash held. Then Harwin rotated the spear with the controlled economy of a man who has practiced this rotation until it lives in his hands rather than his mind. And the dragon steel tip came around and caught the flat of Trant's longsword at the mid-blade. The sound was wrong. Every person within 20 feet heard it and registered wrongness before they understood what they had heard. Not the ring of steel on steel, not the grinding slide of edge against edge, a sharp report, dry, final, the sound of something giving up its structural integrity without negotiation, and half of Meryn Trant's longsword left the melee ring at head height and spun into the fence line crowd, where it struck the top rail and dropped. The crowd at that section of fence made a sound and moved back. Trant stood with the hilt in his hand. He looked at it. The break was clean across the blade, not a fracture, not a bend, cut as if the sword had been resting on a block when someone brought an axe down. He looked at Harwin. Harwin stood with the spear ready. His expression was the same as it had been when Trant started moving toward him. The melee stopped in rings. The fighters nearest to the sound turned first. Then the next ring of fighters turned because the nearest ring had stopped. The stopping propagated outward across the field the way a stone's impact propagated across still water, steadily, inevitably, until the outer edges of the engagement were running out of momentum, not because anything had happened to them directly, but because the center of the field had gone quiet and silence in a melee meant something wrong. 43 men stood in mud looking at the hilt in Meryn Trant's hand. 3 seats from Ned Varys appeared to be studying the cloud formations above the tournament grounds. He had been apparently studying these cloud formations since the first sword broke. His expression was composed and pleasant and completely uninformative, which was the only expression he ever wore and which told Ned more than most faces told him. Littlefinger's hands were on the railing. His knuckles had gone pale around the rail's edge, and he was looking at the 6 northerners in the field with the specific quality of attention that Ned had come to recognize as Littlefinger performing rapid and unwelcome recalculation, the financial model, the leverage structure, the architecture of who owed whom and what forms of debt were transferable, all of it predicated on a world where the Lannister gold mines were the ultimate form of power, where you bought armies with gold and gold remained the scarce resource. 3 seconds of watching castle-forged swords break against northern spears, and the foundation of that model had a crack in it that arithmetic could not fill. Cersei was 4 seats beyond Littlefinger. She had leaned forward when the first sword broke and been back in her seat by the time the crowd registered what had happened. Her face, by the time Ned looked at her, was what it always was, contained, beautiful, precisely calibrated to show nothing that had not been approved for display. But she was watching the field the way she watched things she intended to understand completely before she decided what to do about them. She was not done watching. Robert's hand found Ned's arm before Ned heard him move. He was pulled sideways into the narrow gap behind the gallery seating, out of the immediate sightlines, and Robert was already talking before they cleared the crowd. "Now," Robert said, "now you tell me. Your Grace, don't." Robert's voice dropped. Not quiet. Robert Baratheon did not have a quiet voice, but compressed the way a large man compressed his volume when the room was wrong for what he needed to say. 6 swords, Ned. 6 castle-forged swords. The Kingsguard is standing in a field not knowing what to do, and you're sitting up there with your wine watching it happen, so tell me now. Ned looked at him. Robert's face was the face of a man who had fought battles and recognized when the ground had changed. He was not performing anger. He was trying to understand. "The North found something," Ned said. "Something old. A way to forge steel that hasn't been used in 4,000 years. I've been building it for 9 months. The Night's Watch will be armed with it. When the darkness comes south, the real darkness, the one your rangers have been dying at the wall for 3 years while the court finds reasons to call it exaggeration, this will be the only answer that matters." Robert was very still. "How long have you had this?" "Since autumn. You kept this from me since autumn." "I kept it safe since autumn," Ned said, "from everyone who would have made it into a weapon for the wrong war, including you." He held Robert's gaze. "You would have told Cersei within a fortnight, not from malice, from proximity, from the way marriages work. And then Tywin would have known, and Tywin would have made it into something your kingdom wouldn't survive." Robert stared at him. The melee ground behind them was producing a different kind of noise now. The crowd had found its voice again, and the voice was not the usual tournament roar. It was the sound of people trying to describe something to each other that their vocabulary didn't quite fit. "You're telling me," Robert said slowly, "that my Hand of the King, my oldest friend, has been sitting on a military advantage that makes every other army in Westeros obsolete, and his reason for not telling his king was that his king talks too much in bed." "I would have phrased it differently," Ned said. Robert looked at him for a long moment. The hurt was real. Ned could see it, the genuine injury of a man who measured friendship by the things you didn't keep from each other, and who had just discovered a category of thing he hadn't known existed. Then he laughed, the same laugh as Winterfell. Chest deep, real, unstoppable. He put his hand on Ned's shoulder and left it bare. "What does it do to stone walls?" he said. "We haven't tested stone walls yet," Ned said. Robert's expression suggested this was an oversight he found deeply interesting and intended to pursue at the earliest opportunity. The note arrived at the Tower of the Hand between the morning's second and third ravens. No house colors on the messenger, no seal on the folded parchment. 4 lines in a hand that was so controlled it communicated through its very control exactly who had written it. Lord Tywin Lannister requested a private meeting with the Hand at his earliest convenience. He was currently resident at the Inn of the Green Apple on the Street of Silk. He had arrived in King's Landing the previous evening. He had sent no advance word. Ned read it once. He set it on the desk. He sent for Jory Cassell. "Lord Tywin is in the city," he said. Jory processed this. "Since when?" "Since last night, apparently." Jory looked at the note, at Ned, at the note again. He was doing the arithmetic of a man who had heard the reports from the tournament, who had watched 6 castle-forged swords become 6 expensive mistakes in the span of 3 minutes, and who was now calculating what it meant that Tywin Lannister had crossed the Westerlands and the Gold Road inside 3 weeks of that event. "2 guards at the door," Ned said. "No one else in the solar." Jory left. Ned stayed where he was. He understood Tywin Lannister the way you understood a particular kind of cold, not personally, not warmly, but accurately. A man who had controlled the Westerlands for 40 years through a combination of genuine capability and the strategic application of fear, who had watched the realm rearrange itself around his choices and had concluded from this evidence that the realm was something to be arranged, who had spent 30 years looking for Brightroar and finding nothing and learning, from that failure, something dangerous about patience. 3 weeks from the tournament to King's Landing, Tywin did not move at that speed for curiosity. He sent his acceptance within the hour. Tywin arrived with 30 men and a maester, and absolutely no acknowledgement that arriving in the capital unannounced and summoning the Hand to a meeting on the same day constituted any kind of presumption. He dressed for it correctly, not in the gold and crimson of formal Lannister display, but in traveling clothes of quality, the understated version of house colors, a man arriving for business rather than theater. His maester carried a leather document case. Tywin carried nothing. He was 57 years old and looked like something that had been cut from a harder material than ordinary men. The 2 guards at the solar door stepped aside when he arrived. He did not acknowledge them. He came into the room and saw the arrangement of furniture that Ned had made, the Hand's working desk in its official position, the chair before it angled correctly for a man receiving a petitioner, and he sat down without pause or comment. If the arrangement registered as deliberate positioning, he gave no indication. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair and looked at Ned across the desk. "My Lord Hand," he said, "you're looking well." "My Lord Tywin," Ned said. "The journey was uneventful, I hope." "The Gold Road holds," Tywin said. "You're doing, I understand, the road improvements, partly. Lord Rosby managed the eastern sections. Rosby managed them adequately. You managed them well. A pause. The distinction matters. 7 minutes of this. Ned conducted it without impatience and without any of the social discomfort that men sometimes felt during the ritual preamble to a conversation that everyone in the room understood was actually about something else. He had learned in 35 years of Northern governance that the preamble was not meaningless performance. It was information, the choice of topics, the sequence of compliments, the specific things a man selected to discuss when his real subject was too significant to arrive at quickly. Tywin chose the road, the grain prices, the tournament's attendance numbers, the general health of the small council's function under the new hand, all administrative, all the terrain of a man who governed something large and understood that large things were held together by administrative competence rather than the dramatic interventions that got into the songs. Then, on the 7th minute, without change of tone, your household guard carries Valyrian quality steel. Yes, Ned said. The tournament confirmed it publicly. The accounts from White Harbor's grain shipments, the weight discrepancies, suggest production at scale. He paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence required precision. The process is therefore operational, not theoretical. You have been running it for some months. A year, perhaps. 9 months, Ned said. It was a decision to confirm it. He had made the decision before the meeting, and he held to it now. Partial information served Tywin better than no information, because a man of Tywin's capability would fill gaps with inference, and some of those inferences would be more accurate than the truth. Ned preferred to control what Tywin knew. Tywin nodded once. He reached to the maester beside him, who produced a single folded document from the leather case and placed it on the desk's forward edge. Tywin did not push it across. He left it equidistant, technically neutral territory. The crown's debt, Tywin said. 6 million gold dragons. I will assume it entirely. Liquidate it from Lannister treasury holdings, and the crown will be free of it. A pause. Additionally, 3 million gold dragons transferred directly to the Stark family accounts at the Iron Bank. The Joffrey Sansa betrothal continues with amended terms. The girl keeps her northern household, her septa, her customs. She is not asked to set aside northern practice. Another pause. In exchange, the process is documented in full. The documentation is held jointly. Lannister and Stark, co-signatories, exclusive Lannister production rights in everything south of the neck. Northern production rights remain entirely yours. He stopped. His hands remained on the chair arms. His eyes were watching Ned's hands. No, Ned said. The words sat in the room without apology or elaboration. Tywin absorbed it the way he absorbed information that confirmed rather than surprised him. A single, slight recalibration in the set of his jaw. No to the offer entire, or no to specific terms. No to the offer entire, Ned said. The process belongs to the North. It has belonged to the North since before your ancestors held anything worth calling a holding. I will not sell it, license it, or share it with any house south of the neck, under any terms. Another silence. Tywin picked up his cup from the side table his maester had placed it on. He drank water, not wine, at working meetings which Ned had confirmed from 3 separate sources before today, and set it down again. If the Lannisters arrived at the process independently, he said, the tone of a man asking an academic question, through their own research, you won't, Ned said. The process requires materials that exist in the North and do not exist in the Westerlands. You cannot replicate it with what you have. Tywin was quiet for a moment. The weirwood, he said. Ned's hands remained still on the desk. He held his expression where it was. But something moved behind his eyes, and Tywin Lannister had spent 50 years watching what moved behind men's eyes. The inference had not been in anything Ned said. It was not in the tournament display. It was not in anything Varys would have reported, because Varys did not know. Tywin had arrived at it from the direction of elimination. What the North had that the South did not. What material existed in sufficient quantity above the neck to provide a magical component at production scale. He had narrowed it down. Ned had underestimated the speed of that narrowing by several weeks. He reassessed the man across the desk slightly upward, which was uncomfortable because he had already assessed him very high. The weirwood is one element, Ned said after a moment. One of several. The others are equally non-transferable. Tywin nodded. He set down the cup. He rose. He adjusted his cuffs with 2 precise, unhurried movements, the action of a man returning his appearance to the state it had been in before he sat down. Lord Stark, he said quietly, the Lannisters have eliminated men who held less than this. Ned stood. He did not move out from behind the desk. He did not need to. "My lord Tywin, my son Robb holds Winterfell with 300 men and 500 of these blades. Lord Umber is on the King's Road north of the Riverlands with another force. I have 200 men in this city, armed as you have seen." He looked at Tywin across the desk. "I am aware of the Lannister reputation. I suggest you consider whether the North's reputation does not equally apply." Something moved behind Tywin's eyes. Not anger. Anger was reactive, and reactive men lost. Something colder and more purposeful than anger. "The realm has not seen war like what you're unleashing, my lord." "No, Lord Tywin." Ned held his gaze without moving. "The realm has not seen peace like what I'm offering. I am offering the Seven Kingdoms a weapon that will survive the coming winter. The long night is not a story. The Night's Watch has been dying in proof of it for 3 years. All I ask is that you let me provide what the realm needs to survive it." Tywin looked at him for a long moment. Then he bowed, correctly without irony, and turned and walked to the door. In the corridor outside, his maester fell into step alongside him. They walked 12 paces in silence, past the 2 Stark guards to the stairwell, and Tywin had not spoken by the time they reached it. Then, "Send word to our man in Pentos," he said, "the matter we discussed." The maester did not ask which matter. There was only one matter Tywin had been thinking about for 30 years. The one thing in the world that could answer a weapon the Lannisters couldn't buy, steal, or replicate. He descended the stairs. Ned listened to his footsteps until they were gone. He sat back down at the hand's desk. He looked at the document Tywin had left, the offer still folded, still in its neutral position at the desk's forward edge. He did not open it. He already knew what it said, and what it said was no longer relevant. He sent for Lewin. Robert died the way he had lived, loudly, then slowly, then all at once. The boar found him on the 3rd day of the hunt, in the way that things found men who had spent a decade making themselves slower and less careful than they used to be. The wine was Cersei's doing. Ned had confirmation of this within 6 hours of Robert being carried back to the Red Keep on a litter. From a source that did not need to be named to be trusted, the wine had been pressed on Robert by his squire. The squire answered to Lancel Lannister. Lancel answered to his cousin. The wound was real. The boar had done what boars did. But the man who took that wound should have been sober, and he wasn't. And the difference between those 2 versions of Robert Baratheon was the difference between a survivable injury and a death sentence delivered over 3 days. Ned sat with him through all 3. He sat with him through the first day when Robert was still conscious, and alternating between bravado and grief, and through the second, when the fever built and the lucid hours grew shorter, and through the third, when Robert was mostly somewhere else. Somewhere Ned could not follow, though he stayed in the chair beside the bed and held the space as if his presence could be useful even when it couldn't. He read the medical notes Pycelle produced each morning. He read the evidence in them that no Grand Maester, however careful his language, could fully conceal. He read Joffrey's face in the doorway on the 2nd afternoon. The impatience underneath the performance of grief, the way his eyes moved to the window rather than to his father, calculating something that had nothing to do with the dying man in the bed. He read all of it. He also, in the time between readings, prepared. Robert died at dawn. Ned was not with him at the moment. He had been told it was close, and had remained in the council chamber where the small council and the assembled lords of the Red Keep were already gathered, because the work of what came next needed to begin the moment the breath stopped, and sentiment could not be allowed to cost the realm the first hour. Pycelle brought the news personally. He announced it to the chamber with the gravity of a man who had attended many such moments and understood that his function was to make the moment official rather than felt. Ned presented the evidence, the blood records and birth testimony, the mathematics of coloring and bloodline that any honest maester would confirm on inspection. Pycelle read the documents with the expression of a man recognizing what he was being asked to certify and calculating how much of his own future depended on certifying it accurately. The truth was plain. Joffrey was not Robert's son. Cersei's children carried no drop of Baratheon blood that the records could account for. The evidence made the case without requiring Ned to say another word beyond what the documents said themselves. Lyanna's words, the other truth, the heavier one, the one Ned had carried alone for 15 years, stayed where it had always lived. Inside him, not yet the council's knowledge, and perhaps not any council's business for some time yet. Tonight's truth was sufficient for tonight's purpose. He declared his support for Stannis Baratheon as the rightful heir, Robert's eldest surviving legitimate brother, with the clearest lawful claim now that Joffrey's parentage was established. He sent ravens northeast to Dragonstone, to the lords of each region, with the evidence appended. He had the ravens ready. He had had them ready for 2 days. Cersei and Joffrey to protected quarters, not a dungeon, not in chains, but secured, because they were Baratheons by name even if not by blood, and they were not his to execute. Myrcella and Tommen removed from proximity to the political situation and placed under the protection of Sir Barristan Selmy in the Red Keep's family quarters, separated from the council chambers by enough corridors and closed doors that the noise of the night's decisions would not reach them. They were children. Children did not inherit the crimes of their parents, not in his law, not in any law he intended to enforce. The last raven was the shortest. 2 words, addressed to Robb Stark at Winterfell. Hold. The North holds. He sealed it himself, he handed it to the maester. He watched it leave the window. Then he turned back to the chamber and the work of it. He did none of it with satisfaction. There was no version of this morning that produced satisfaction. Robert was dead, and the realm's new shape was a thing no one had yet seen clearly enough to agree on. What he felt was the particular quality of fatigue that came not from physical effort, but from the sustained compression of doing the right thing inside conditions that were actively hostile to the right thing being done. He had started preparing for this the night he opened the iron door in the lower crypts. Varys appeared at his elbow. "You'll want to sleep at some point, my lord. When the ravens are confirmed," Ned said. "Of course." Varys paused. For what it's worth, Lord Stark, Robert was lucky in his choice of friends. Ned looked at the window. The dawn was coming in gray and certain over the bay, the same dawn that arrived every morning regardless of what the night had been. He was unlucky in almost everything else, Ned said. It should have been enough to balance it. Tywin did not call it war. In his dispatches to the lords of the Westerlands, and Ned had copies of 3 of them courtesy of sources that did not require naming, he called it a restoration of lawful order against the illegal seizure of the Iron Throne by a northern lord operating without mandate. The language was precise, and Tywin had constructed it carefully, anticipating that these documents would eventually be read by historians. He was a man who thought about historians. He wanted the record to reflect that he had named what he was doing correctly before he did it. The lords of the Westerlands raised their banners within a fortnight of the ravens leaving Casterly Rock. 18,000 men in the field by the end of the 3rd week, with the Lannister household guard as its professional corps, and the vassal levies filled out around it with the weight of houses that owed their current prosperity to the Lannister name, and understood that prosperity was not permanent. Ned marched west with 16,000 Northern and Riverlands men and 2,000 fighters from the Vale under Stannis Baratheon's nominal command. Nominal because Stannis was a man of the sea and knew it, and had the self-knowledge to place his land campaign in the hands of the man best positioned to conduct it. They met the first Lannister force at a river crossing 3 days west of River Run. The cavalry came the way Lannister cavalry always came, organized, fast, with the confidence of men whose equipment was the best available in the 7 kingdoms. The equipment was no longer the best available. The charge met the northern spear line at full extension, and what happened next was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was the moment before a battle, stretched into a few minutes of collective recalibration. Lannister longswords connected with dragonsteel spear tips, at the speed of a cavalry charge, and the swords absorbed the impact, the way swords absorbed impacts, right up until the dragonsteel did what dragonsteel did. And what should have been the shock of a defended spear line became instead 30 horsemen holding hilt stumps and looking at the northern infantry that had not moved. The cavalry pulled back. A dismounted assault followed, because Lannister commanders were adaptive and understood that mounted charges into that line were an exercise in expensive failure. The dismounted assault fared marginally better. At least the men could stop when they understood what was happening, rather than being carried forward by momentum. But stopping in front of men whose weapons could destroy yours while yours could not harm theirs was its own kind of defeat. The psychology of it moved through the Lannister formation from the front ranks backward, one man telling the next what he had just seen, the information arriving faster than any order could contain it. The first engagement lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. The second, 6 days later at a crossroads south of the Golden Tooth, lasted 50 minutes. The third, in a valley 2 days west of that, lasted 23 minutes from first contact to the Lannister commander sending a rider with a white cloth. No battle lasted long enough for the terrain to matter. No battle lasted long enough for the Lannister numbers to matter. The mathematics of warfare that Tywin had spent 40 years mastering were mathematics that depended on two forces being equipped in ways that made force sizes and terrain meaningful. These were not those conditions. Casterly Rock was not a castle. It was a mountain with ambitions. 3 miles long, 700 feet above the sea, at its highest point, honeycombed through its interior by 4,000 years of Lannister expansion, rooms, passages, wells, storerooms, barracks, all connected by a system of corridors that no outside force had ever fully mapped. The harbor at its foot gave it supply from the sea. The cliff faces on 3 sides gave it natural defense that no siege engine had historically been able to address. The main approaches were 3 narrow defiles, each with gates, the outer gate famous across Westeros as the most material-intensive defensive construction since the Wall. 30 feet of iron-faced stone. Ned's engineers had spent 2 weeks before the march building what Lewin had designed. The ram was unlike anything in the historical record. Not a traditional suspended beam, but a focused penetrating system, weighted precisely, moving on a wheeled frame that could be repositioned to address different sections of the gate face. Its striking surface was dragon steel plate, thick, shaped to a shallow wedge, with dragon steel cutting edges along both lateral faces. The theory: peel the iron facing, expose the stone beneath, crack the mortar at the structural joints with the ram's weight. The theory held. The iron facing of the outer gate was 4 inches thick, cold-hammered, pinned to the stone behind it, with iron anchors set 3 feet deep into the rock. The dragon steel ram faces connected with it at the first stroke and cut through the outer surface layer the way a knife cut through aged cheese. Not dramatically, not in one blow, but with a clean, progressive removal of material that produced a sound like nothing Ned's engineers had heard before. Not hammering, not grinding, a low, continuous note, like a very large stone being moved very slowly across a stone floor. By the end of the 5th day, 30 square feet of iron facing had been removed. The stone beneath it was exposed, old and close-grained, Westerland's granite built to last 10,000 years. But stone without its iron reinforcement was stone subject to the ram's weight, and the ram's weight, applied to the mortar lines at the gate's structural joints, began producing hairline fractures by the end of the 6th day. By the end of the 11th day, the outer gate of Casterly Rock fell. Not dramatically, not all at once. The compromised mortar gave way in the lower section first, and the upper section followed within minutes as the weight redistribution ran out of structural logic to hold it together. The gate came down in 3 pieces, each piece producing a sound that Ned's soldiers heard from a quarter-mile back in camp. The dust it raised was visible from the sea. Tywin watched from the upper battlements. He had watched every day. He had brought a camp chair to the battlements on the 3rd day, when it became clear that this would be the kind of siege that rewarded close observation, and each morning his maester accompanied him with documents to review while he watched, so that the act of watching appeared administrative rather than what it actually was, the focused attention of a man trying to find the weakness in a system he had not yet found the weakness in. There was no weakness. He understood this by the 8th day. He had understood it intellectually since the tournament, but understanding a thing intellectually and watching it dismantle the outer gate of your family's seat were different orders of understanding. His options arranged themselves in the order he had been arranging them since the 2nd engagement. Fight on, the 2nd gate in 2 weeks, the 3rd in a month, the rock taken by a force that had not yet sustained a casualty worth recording. Surrender, unconditional. Negotiate, find the terms he could live with and the man in the opposing camp who had the authority to offer them. He sent for Jon Snow. The room they gave him was in the Rock's inner guest quarters. Lannister courtesies maintained even in the final days of a siege, because Tywin Lannister did not conduct himself with less precision under pressure than without it. Jon came armed. He was 17 years old and had Ned Stark's economy of movement and the particular quality of stillness that men who had trained seriously from childhood carried in their bodies without being aware they were carrying it. He looked, Tywin thought, like the North had been trying to produce something for 8,000 years and had finally gotten the formula correct. "You are Aegon Targaryen," Tywin said. "Yes," Jon said. He did not qualify it, did not perform uncertainty about it or relief at saying it aloud. It was simply true, and he treated it as simply true. The Iron Throne belongs to you by blood right under Targaryen succession law. Yes. Tywin looked at him. "I will publicly acknowledge your claim. Support your coronation. Surrender the rock this morning, without further resistance, without terms regarding the garrison." A pause. "In exchange for a full pardon for House Lannister, retention of all Westerland's holdings, and your personal assurance that the Dragonsteel process will not be shared with any other house in the realm." Jon was quiet for a moment. He looked at Tywin the way people looked at a complex thing they were solving in their head, not with hostility, not with admiration, with attention. "You're asking me to protect your house's power," Jon said, "in exchange for something you've already lost." He stood. He moved toward the door. "The pardon I'll grant," he said without turning back. "My uncle taught me that vengeance is not justice, and I have no cause to doubt him. The Westerlands you'll keep. The people there didn't start this, and they'll bear enough of the cost as it is. The Dragonsteel I cannot promise. It belongs to my family, not to me alone. The North will decide what the North does with what the North holds." He stopped at the door, turned once. "But you have my word. No Lannister soldier harmed. No Lannister land seized. You surrender, we stop." Tywin said nothing for a long moment. "That's more than I offered your grandfather," he said. Jon's hand was on the doorframe. "My grandfather is dead," he said, and left. The rock surrendered at dawn. The document was 2 pages. Tywin signed it himself, at a table brought into the gate passage with a Lannister candle burning at each corner, because he was going to do this correctly or not at all. His hand was steady. His maester witnessed it. Ned witnessed it from the opposing side. When it was done, Tywin folded his copy and gave it to his maester, and said nothing and walked back into the rock. That night, in his solar on the rock's 3rd level, Tywin sat at his writing table with the Lannister family history he had been annotating for 3 decades. He found the entry for Bright Roar. He read what he had written there across 30 years of marginal notes, the search attempts, the failures, the logical dead ends, the slow accumulation of evidence that the weapon was simply gone. He added 1 line. He wrote it carefully, in the same controlled hand that had written everything else. He closed the book. He did not open it again. He had known for 2 months. Not the suspicion. The suspicion had lived in the back of his skull since childhood, the way certain kinds of cold lived in stone, present always beneath the surface warmth of rooms and fires and everything the living world put over it. The suspicion was old. The knowledge was 2 months old. And the difference between them was the difference between a wound and a scar. One of them still bleeding, one of them finished with that particular work and now simply part of the landscape of him. He had stopped flinching when people called him Lord Snow. That was the first thing Ned noticed. The training yard was empty at this hour. Before the kitchen fires were lit, before the stable hands started their morning circuits, before Winterfell folded back into the noise of a great house at work. This was the hour Jon had always claimed for himself, and he had not stopped claiming it since returning from the Westerlands. He moved through the sword form with the economy of a man who had trained past the point where training required thought. The blade was Longclaw, the Mormont bastard sword, the direwolf pommel worn smooth from months of ranging, Valyrian steel that had gone north to the wall and come back carrying the weight of everything that had happened to its bearer since. Ned leaned on the fence rail and watched him finish the form. Jon stood at the end of it, the blade down, breathing the cold morning air with the steadiness of a man whose body had been through enough that it had learned to take what it could get without demanding more. He looked at Ned. "Did she know what he was?" he said. Not a question. The shape of a question with the weight of something that had been sitting in him long enough to have worn grooves. Ned was quiet for a long time. The yard held the particular stillness of Winterfell mornings in late winter, the cold so established it had become structural, part of the architecture. "She knew he was the dragon's son," he said finally. "I think she knew, from the stories, from all of it, that the dragon's son and the wolf's daughter would make something the world needed." He stopped. He looked at the yard rather than at Jon. "She died before she could know she was right." Jon wrapped his hand around Longclaw's pommel. He did not look at his father. "She was right," he said. "I hope someone told her." "The old gods knew," Ned said. "They were listening when you were born." The yard was quiet between them. 2 men who had learned to carry large things in small containers, standing in the cold that had shaped them both. Jon nodded once. He wrapped the blade and walked inside. The coronation happened at Winterfell. The southern lords had argued for King's Landing, for the Iron Throne, for the sept and the anointing oil and the 1,000-year tradition of southern crowning ceremonies. Jon listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had already decided and was extending others the courtesy of being heard before the decision remained what it was. He was crowned in the Winterfell Great Hall. The court had come north. 2 weeks of King's Road travel, the great houses arriving in sequence, each column watching the next day's weather with the suspicion of men who had heard about northern winters in the way you heard about things you had never experienced and did not entirely believe. They arrived believing they would find a border fort dressed as a castle. They found Winterfell, which had been answering that particular misapprehension for 8,000 years. The ceremony was 2 ceremonies conducted simultaneously: the Andal rites for the lords who required the sept's blessing, and the genealogy recitation and the formal language of southern succession. The first men rites, shorter, older, conducted in the Godswood before a heart tree that had been watching Stark lords take oaths since before the Andals crossed the narrow sea. For everyone else, Jon stood in both. He did not apologize for either. Lewin supervised the crown. A dragon steel circlet, no jewels, no filigree, no lion finials or stag antlers or Targaryen dragons rendered in decorative metal. A band of the blue-black material, simple, closed, light enough in the hand that you expected it to sit lightly on the skull and heavy enough once it was there, that you always knew it. It absorbed the candlelight of the great hall the way all dragon steel absorbed light, taking it in without returning it, the surface drinking the gold of the flames and giving back nothing. Ned placed it on his head. Jon did not close his eyes for it. He looked at the assembled hall. The armor was waiting in the anteroom. Ned had built it over 6 months in the deep forge, in secret from Jon, in the same weirwood coal heat and blood covenant process that had produced everything else. A full harness in the stark gray style, dragon steel plate from gorget to greave, lighter than castle-forged plate by a meaningful margin, warm to the touch in the inexplicable way that all the Winterfell steel ran warm, as if the process that made it had left something in it that had not finished working yet. Jon wore it for the first time at the coronation. He did not take it off for what followed. In the gallery, Sansa watched him walk to the high seat and said quietly, "He looks like what's coming." Arya beside her did not take her eyes off her brother below. "Good," she said. The raven from Castle Black arrived at midday, in the middle of the coronation feast. Jon read it at the table without standing. His face did not change while he read. He folded it once, placed it beside his untouched plate, and returned to the business of receiving the oaths of the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms. The kneeling, the spoken words, the hands pressed between his, the formal transfer of loyalty from one arrangement of the realm to another, he accepted all of it with the same steady attention. He thanked each lord by name. He made a speech about the winter that was coming that was so quiet and so certain that the southern lords who had spent a year finding reasons to keep it theoretical found themselves unable to keep it theoretical in the same room as him. Then he rose. He apologized for the early departure. He said what needed to be said without saying what the raven had contained, because the lords of the Seven Kingdoms were going to learn what was moving north of the wall soon enough, and they would learn it correctly, through the proper channels with the proper orders already in motion, not from a coronation feast, not in the first hour of a new reign. 3,000 soldiers were saddled before the feast's second course. Robb rode with him. Arya rode with him, over Ned's stated objection and with Robb's conditional agreement that she would remain with the rear guard, which she accepted with the expression of a woman who found conditional agreements a useful starting position for subsequent negotiation. Ned stayed south. The realm needed governance, and governance needed Ned. And Jon needed to be at the wall without his father in the specific way that men needed to do the hardest things without the people who had always done hard things for them. They rode north on the King's Road, and the cold came to meet them before they were out of the Riverlands. Castle Black at the witching hour held 11,000 men with their weapons out. Sam Tarly had seen it from the south rampart. He had been there at the second hour past midnight, making a notation in his records. The temperature drop had been significant enough to log a 15-degree fall in 4 hours, the kind of number that the Watch's historical records associated with particular conditions north of the wall. He had looked up from the notation to confirm the wind direction. He had seen the color change at the northern horizon, not darkness. The night was already dark. This was something different. A light that was not light, a cold luminescence, the sky behaving the way sky did not behave, the stars at the northern horizon going very bright and very still, holding as if they had been told to hold. He had watched it for 60 seconds before understanding what he was looking at. He had run. Jon stood at the top of Castle Black's south gate and looked north through the black arch of the wall's tunnel opening. The night was absolute. Absolute in the way that only this night, at this moment, in this place had ever been absolute, as if the dark had achieved something it had been building toward for 8,000 years and was now simply being what it had always been underneath everything else. Below him 11,000 men had their weapons out. The dragon steel spear tips in the front, 2,000 ranks held nothing. No light, no gleam, the surface as dark as the sky above them. But when the torches along the wall's ramparts moved in the wind, the blue-black ripple ran through those 2,000 points like something alive, like a signal passing through water. There and gone, and there again. The dragon glass behind them. The dragon steel daggers at every man's belt. The fire teams with their oil and their torches, positioned at 30-yard intervals through the formation, assigned and rehearsed and ready in the way that only men who knew precisely what they were standing in front of could be ready. 11,000 weapons rose when Jon came down the steps. He did not call them up. He did not command it. He simply descended from the gate and walked through the formation toward the front line, and the weapons came up in sequence as he passed, rank by rank, the way sound traveled through stone, steadily, without gap. He took his position at the front. He had gray, Stark eyes, and Rhaegar's blood and 8,000 years of firstmen's stubbornness running through the marrow his mother had given him. He had a dragon steel crown that drank the torchlight. He had a Valyrian steel bastard sword in his hand that had already killed one White Walker and had been waiting since to finish what it started. He had 4,000 years of a secret his ancestors had buried for him to find when the moment required finding it. He had his family at his back. The army of the dead came out of the trees, numberless, soundless, the silence moving ahead of them like a tide displacing the night's natural quiet. The Night King's cold came with them, the temperature dropping another 10 degrees in the span of 2 minutes, and the men in the front rank felt it in their chests, in the specific place where cold went when it was not simply weather. The gate opened. 11,000 men with weapons that could kill what was coming stepped through it, and for the first time in 8,000 years, the darkness met something prepared for it. The long night came. The North was ready. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.